I am here with Dr. Mark Atherton. It's quite a broad swath of English history and linguistics that you seem to specialize in. Could you narrow it down a bit as to what you primarily teach and write about?
Okay, so I teach in a literature department, and I teach Old English, that's Anglo-Saxon literature, and Middle English literature. So that would be Beowulf on the one hand, and Chaucer, the Age of Chaucer on the other, and Geoffrey Chaucer. And I teach some linguistics, English language as well. And I've written on Tolkien. But I think the connections are clear there. He was very interested in linguistics, and he was a professor of Anglo-Saxon literature. So or rather, I cover a lot of ground that he.
First of all, thank you very much for joining me. I know it's the evening your time. We're in the morning here on the West Coast of the United States, and I know you're getting over a cold. So if you need to take a break, get some water.
Good to be here.
Yeah, no, it's a pleasure. And I'm always fascinated by the backgrounds of people's offices or studios, because we're in the Zoom age. We're in the pandemic age. We're pulling out of it, but people have discovered that actually doing video conferencing is not just preferable, but not all that difficult. But I love to take a look at people's backgrounds and their literal backgrounds. And in my case, I have animation cells. I have a couple of The Simpsons TV show skateboards. I have a lot of tchotchkes from my voiceover career. And as expected with you, it's books and looks to be some kind of, personal effect or artifact behind you there over your left shoulder. What exactly is that, if I may ask?
Well, there's two things there.
Well, there's one over it's just inside the left frame of yours. It's wooden.
Oh, I see,
Yeah.
up here.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is an Anglo-Saxon lyre, or a reproduction of a lyre from the early medieval period in England.
Gotcha. Now, I have a Fender Squier Stratocaster, which is basically your entry-level Fender guitar, and I'm learning guitar. And you obviously...
very good.
Oh yeah, I need to upgrade at some point, but I need to get good enough to justify it. But
yeah, well, the Squire is supposed to be a good starting guitar, isn't it? It's good quality.
Yeah,
I've got a PRS SE electric guitar.
Really?
I have quite a collection of instruments.
And I've noticed
so I have various instruments round and about in this room as well.
Gotcha. And you do pub gigs when you're not teaching.
I do
pub
gigs and very small festivals, like in the summer.
I guess
end of January we're doing one.
Really?
Yeah.
And my wife is a musician. She studied at the Musicians Institute here in Los Angeles, but she grew up in Venezuela, grew up with a completely different musical culture, but she's very musical. I am musical in the sense that I know what I can appreciate, but I'm learning an instrument for the first time really in my life, and at 53 I'm doing this. But it opens up hemispheres of your brain that you never really were aware of. The connection between your fingers, what thoughts you have, what you're trying to express. It's amazing to me, and I'm sure from a historical perspective, the use of music and poetry in medieval times must have been extremely important for disseminating news, stories, all of that.
Yeah, I mean, in a society where only a few people knew how to read or write, there must have been a lot of spoken word, oral transmission of information, news, of course,
right,
and current affairs, but also old stories passed down the generations, that kind of thing.
Gotcha.
And music, I mean, if you think about, the performance of then they probably had a lyre like the one behind me, behind my left shoulder, as you say, to add a rhythm or something and then the poem would have been chanted, we think, or possibly sung, or maybe a combination of both. And so that would accompany the performance, the story, the narrative.
Right. You mentioned Tolkien. You're obviously very familiar with his work and, of course, his career. He was an Oxford professor like you are. And the use of linguistics in his work is, I mean, it's almost a pillar of what he writes about, because there's a wonderful movie. I can't remember the actor's name, but it's called Tolkien. And it's about his...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. It's about his days at Oxford, and he convinces an Oxford professor to let him into his program because he's created his own language. And
Yeah.
he was always fascinated by that, by how a culture would create a language and how it would use one word as a reference to something because perhaps it was influenced by another language or another culture entirely. Languages and cultures are so intermingled, and I know
Yeah.
from the brief bit of reading I've done in Anglo-Saxon times, I've written a bit of historical science fiction. It's not, I'm hybrid publishing it. It's not out yet, but it deals with the 10th century in England and the Vikings, basically the Danes, against King Edward and Queen Ethelfleda, although she was the Lady Ethelfleda. And what I learned was there were so many similarities between Danish and Anglo-Saxon that a lot of the words were interchangeable.
Well, that's right. You can find on YouTube one or two experts out there who can demonstrate how a conversation might have worked in Old English and Danish. So the grammar was a bit different, but if they spoke slowly,
right,
they probably would have been able to work out what each person was saying to the other,
Right. The funny thing is that as much as they fought with each other, they also spent almost as much time not fighting and trading and exchanging cultures, things like that.
Well, I mean, they obviously most of them came from Denmark and Norway,
right?
Especially Denmark. And after a series of wars, in the 9th century they settled in. In fact, there was a battle against King Alfred, the King of Wessex, and they had a peace treaty after that. And they had something called the Danelaw. There is an old Roman road which goes kind of diagonally up southern Britain, so that old Roman road is more or less was used as the boundary between English England and what they used to call the Danelaw, where the Danish laws were in. And lots of farmers must have come over, after the Viking soldiers, the warriors had their due,
right,
and settled as farmers. So they were not Vikings as such. They were simply Danish settlers, and they must have mixed with the local people. But if you go to that part of England, sort of East Anglia, Yorkshire, the East Coast, the place names are influenced by Danish. So you get place names like Grimsby, and that by ending is found in Denmark and Scandinavia as well as I suppose. Grimsby is Grimstown and so on. And they talk about dales as valleys and fells, the mountains. And these words are coming to the language from old Scandinavian, from old Norse. And
right.
So some of the people, the way they speak, you wonder if their accent has been influenced by Scandinavian. And some of the words, they'll say, so the word gate in Anglo-Saxon, in Scandinavian, gate, gata, means a street or a way. So in the dialects, when people are speaking local dialect, they say get a gate, get a way, that sort of thing.
That's interesting.
So these connections are still there,
Yeah, and I'm learning Spanish because my wife is Venezolana, and street in Spanish is calle. So Calle, which of course obviously comes from the Spanish from Spain. And then Spain, obviously in antiquarian times, Spain was not exactly round the corner from Scandinavia, but there was enough time for a lot of cultural exchange to happen. And I wonder, you say gata, calle, they're not that dissimilar. We're not as separate as we like to think.
There could be connections. Yeah,
Yeah,
all sorts
exactly.
of.
I first was exposed to the idea of the history of a language in college. We're going back a long time. Back around
What do you,
1988, I think I took the history of the English language
oh,
at a
very good.
local college, and I thought, oh, well, this will be easy. And I think I got a C. I got a mediocre mark in it. It was absolutely overwhelming the amount of influences that have filtrated into the English language over thousands and thousands of years, and just Anglo-Saxon times. I mean, one of the takeaways I had was if you went back 500-600 years ago in England, you wouldn't understand much of what people said compared to the way they speak today. And 1,000 years ago, you'd be utterly lost. And
Yeah, I mean, you might think that. Although I like to think that maybe, some of the words would, when you see it written down, it looks, well, that can't be like English.
right.
But I mean, just an expression like today
Hmm.
in Anglo-Saxon, in Old English, 1,000 years ago, that would be today. Bye.
Right. Okay. You'd get that.
You
Yeah.
know, I mean, there are things like, oh, give me something, give me ween, give me wine.
Uh,
After a while, you'd probably get the idea of
you'd
what's
work.
going on.
Okay. So you'd work that much out.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I guess the one question I have obviously is what attracted you to linguistics as a pursuit, as a sort of career path.
Yeah, that's a good question. I suppose it must go back to my secondary school, and maybe travel. Travel with. We used to go with our family to France and Germany for holidays.
Hmm.
Maybe that there was a little bit of interest in the languages that we of the places we went to. I suppose
Gotcha.
I learned French first when I was quite little. I didn't learn it very well, but I learned a little bit of French
Right.
when I was 9 years old.
Right.
And
Exactly.
so you get a taste for that. And I think I must have read The Lord of the Rings when I was about 15 in the school library. They had the 3 volumes separate, and I
Hmm.
read them there. And I picked up on Tolkien's interest in language just from reading The Lord of the Rings. And so I think that's why I wanted to learn German, because I knew it was a bit like Old English, and that
Right.
they were related languages. And so I thought, well, I can't learn Old English in this school. They don't teach it. So I'll learn German instead. And in fact, it is true. They are similar languages. They are different as well. They're like sister languages.
Uh-huh.
If you do know some German, it will help you to learn Old.
One of the things that has always fascinated me about English history is that you can almost bifurcate it into pre-William the Conqueror and post-William the Conqueror. I mean, officially, that is kind of how it's done. Since 1066, it's been England as we know it, because he finally gathered all these tribes together and said, I'm it, this is the rule, and now let's start making the Domesday Book and see what we've got here. But unless I miss my guess, and you'll know better than I do, Tolkien was kind of enamored of the time before then. That he was not a
Of course, yeah.
fan of the internal combustion engine, says that was maybe the worst invention ever, and loved the idea of England before all that.
Yeah, he certainly did. And I think the attraction is, let's think of a word that goes back to the Old English times, because a lot of our words, a lot of our everyday words that
Uh-huh.
we speak,
Hmm.
go back way back to Old English
Hmm.
or the Norman Conquest. So if I say words we speak, the words we speak, those 4 words are.
Hmm.
But if we think of a word like king, that goes back as well. King, queen,
Right.
they're both. And what is the adjective to go with king? I mean, you don't use it so much in the United States of America since independence, but we still use it. We have a postal service, and what do we call it? We call it the Royal Mail.
Hmm.
We don't call it the Kingly Mail.
Hmm.
We call it the Royal Mail. Now, why is that? It's because the Normans brought their French language with them,
Hmm.
and So the king in French is roi, and the word for royal in French is royal.
Uh-huh.
So we don't say the kingly post or the kingly mail; we say the royal mail. And this is one of the reasons why, because if you go to Germany, the word for a king is König, and
Hmm.
if you wanted to say royal mail, they don't have a king either. It would be Königlicher Post. So you just take the king word and add an adjective ending to it, and you get the word. So what's happened is that English has become it's got a larger vocabulary now, but it's not connected anymore.
Right.
King and kingly, those two words are connected, but king and royal are not connected. They're separate words. One's from Old English or Anglo-Saxon, if you prefer, and the other is from French. Does that make sense? So I think he disliked the fact that English had become broader and was borrowing words, and so it lost its coherence. It lost its kind of. He found a sort of attraction, a beauty in languages that fitted together neatly, and
Right.
he liked the sound of languages as well.
Oh, yes. And clearly, obviously, this was manifested in his creation of languages. In
Yeah, yeah,
probably, this is clearly, I think, a romantic person who loved picturing a world and said, okay, I'm going to make this as real as I can. Well, then they need to have their own language. And if I get to play God here, what are the boundaries going to be? How are the words going to be formed? And I'm sure he has. I've never examined his Elven language, but I'm sure he has very hard and fast rules for pronunciation and very hard and fast rules for verb conjugation and things like that. I
yeah.
would
It's all
imagine.
there. It's all
Yeah,
there.
yeah, exactly. And I don't know how much time he would have spent on it, but I would imagine it would have been quite a bit, quite a while before he realized this has got to stand on its own logic so that somebody, maybe an archaeologist from far in the future, might not be able to tell the difference between this language and one that was actually spoken widely.
Yeah, no, certainly. And because he was a specialist in languages, he knew how they worked. He knew
Hmm.
they how languages change, how pronunciation changes over time, and so he could fit that into his system.
Hmm.
So, in fact, there are two Elvish languages, and I suppose one has developed slightly over time as well.
Hmm.
It's even at that level of detail. He's interested in creating his languages, and so it's not just the Elvish languages as well. He creates other languages for people to use. So the riders of Rohan,
Hmm.
in the Two Towers, they are very close to Anglo-Saxon Anglo-Saxon culture, really.
Hmm.
So the scene in the book, it's called "The King in the Golden Hall," I think. So that arrival that's in the
Hmm.
land of and going to the hall, and the guardian of the hall allows them to come in, and they have to leave their weapons at the door,
Hmm.
and then they meet the king. This is a very similar scene in the old heroic poem Beowulf.
Hmm.
Beowulf arrives in Denmark, and he's shown into the hall, and even the names of the people there are Old English names. So Theoden is the name of the king in Tolkien's Lord of the Rowan is Theoden. That means prince or king in Old English, and you'll find the word.
Hmm.
So even at that level, and he quotes a little bit of their poetry, and it's basically very similar to Beowulf in its style and themes, and
Right.
so all these details are kind of necessary for him, at least,
Hmm.
so that he can create his narratives. The languages came first,
Yes.
and then the story develops and the characters develop from there.
Right. I'm curious as to how. I don't know if this is something that is noticeable in Anglo-Saxon language and current English language and all that, but how languages evolve, how so many things in a culture evolve are so influenced by the actual environment, the weather, the whether it's very hot, whether it's very cold, whether it's very rainy. I wonder if words were formed that you might say, well, you know what? That's the kind of word people would use if it was always very cold and they didn't get a chance to speak as much because they were too busy shivering. I really am curious as to whether or not there's a physiological component to how words might be formed based on the kind of topography and climate of a culture. And I wonder if that's ever been examined.
I think it's quite a difficult one
Yeah.
it would be a difficult thesis to prove.
Yeah.
I haven't done any research. I don't actually know of any research.
I've always been curious about that, but I guess, yeah, nobody can really prove, all right, they
You
spoke
can't
this
prove
way.
it from the sounds of the language, I don't think.
Yeah.
But what people have noticed is that if you need a word for different kinds of fog and mist and cloud formations, because you see them a lot,
Exactly.
then the vocabulary of a language can develop to reflect the topography.
Now, we've been using language as a species for, I don't know, how far back could you say that biologists can say with some certainty that we've actually started using verbal communication? You know, the most rudimentary parts of it. This is rock. This is fire. This is, animal.
Again, this is part of the mystery of language. I think it goes back as far as Homo sapiens.
Okay.
We think, because the human race hasn't changed so much that they couldn't
Right.
have spoken, but because they didn't write anything down,
Right.
we don't know what their
Right.
language was like. But what we do know is that anywhere in the world, languages are always complex.
Yeah.
They don't. It's not so that if you go into, into Native American languages, apparently I don't know them at all, but apparently they're very complex in their structure. Or Aboriginal languages in Australia, or languages of the Bushmen in Africa. All these languages are in their own way complex and have complexities that maybe another language doesn't have. So each language has its own special way of doing things, sometimes more complex than others.
Right.
Even English. I mean, people sometimes, some of my German friends say that English is quite a simple language, and I say, well, okay, when you stop making mistakes, I'll believe you.
Yeah. I don't know of any easy languages to learn because they have so many idiosyncrasies and rules that do not align with your native tongue. I mean, I would imagine if you're a Spaniard and you're learning Italian, okay, that's not going to be a big jump.
Okay, it depends who's learning what.
Exactly.
Course, yeah.
Spanish to Portuguese and vice versa. But if you're
Germans learning Dutch, they can.
Yes.
They're the best learners of Dutch.
Right. If you're English and you're trying to learn Russian, good luck to you. It's not going to just fall right off your tongue.
No, it's not.
No.
I've done it. I've tried it.
Okay. Right. So I would say then, okay, in the neighborhood of 100,000 years then we've probably been, I mean, we've had...
that's right.
Yeah. I mean, we've had vocalization capability for a long time, and this would have been purely utilitarian. If you can vocalize, then that's a much more effective way to communicate than just waving your hands at somebody if they're not looking at you. And so the first languages slowly start to, I don't know, crawl from the primordial ooze, and then which takes us to now, and this is something I have to ask a linguist. This is sort of this pet peeve I have is I was an English minor in college, and so that was not my primary area of study, but I was able to minor in it, and so I sometimes grammatically can get on somebody if they're just misusing the language. And to this day, I am still peeved that irregardless has been officially entered into the dictionary. I don't know if it's the OED that has done it, but irregardless has been used so prominently by so many people, they finally shrugged and said, okay, fine, it's an official word. And, and I've always seen this as, well, you shouldn't have given up so easily. You should have simply said, no, that's not a correct word. And then I realized, how many words do we have in our language right now that we accept as normal, that we've used for decades, that were probably malapropisms from a century or more ago?
And it's very interesting. And when you go back to Shakespeare's time and look at his vocabulary, there are all sorts of words there which might have come into modern English and didn't. And sometimes they didn't get into the mainstream, but now they've appeared.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, there's a sort of flexibility with language, and words can come and go sometimes. They can go out of fashion and suddenly become popular again. I mean, I'm trying to think of an example. The only one is perhaps not a very good example. It's cool. I'm sure that was really big in the 60s.
Cool.
1960s, 1970s. And it seemed to go, well, certainly in Britain, it seemed to go out of fashion.
Yeah.
And now it's back.
I've never stopped using it. Now,
you've never stopped. Okay.
I've never stopped using it, but
But maybe in California it's always been in, you know.
Right. Well, I grew up in the deep south of the United States, but I moved to California 25 years ago, and I never stopped using it. Now, I was born in 1969. So probably at the apex of the word cool. And in the 70s, there was a very popular TV show called Happy Days, which was based in the 50s. And,
I remember it. We came to Britain.
Right. And the Fonz, Arthur Fonzarelli, Henry Winkler's character, was the coolest guy, and he would use the word cool. And that probably helped carry that word for another 10 or 15 years. And then surf culture became very popular in the 80s all across this country. And cool was a very big part of surf culture. So I have no idea if it's ever fallen out of fashion because I'm officially uncool. I am at an age where nobody looks to their hip cues. Nobody looks to get hipness cues from me. But I do know that there's a word that, because I discovered it in comic books from the 50s. There was a word in the 50s. It kind of means what cool means now. But in the 50s, it was called reet, R-E-E-T.
Oh, wow.
I have no idea where that word came from. But I think in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, it was used. It has disappeared. Nobody uses that word now, and they wouldn't know what you mean if you did it. So as you say, it's simply a word that, evolutionarily speaking, wasn't equipped to survive.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Well, that's... and there are lots of stories like this. And then sometimes a word manages to get hold and come into the language.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm trying to think. In linguistics, people talk about appropriate use of language. And I think in school I was taught to say appropriateness. But you find a lot of linguists writing appropriacy. As well.
Appropriacy.
Yeah, appropriacy means using the appropriate language for a particular situation.
Uh-huh.
You know, so if you want to be polite, you say sir or madam in a shop.
Right.
You know, so that's appropriacy. I mean, I don't think it's caught on with the ordinary people, but it's sort of being used, you know, as a word.
Well, that also begs the question, as anyone who would study any kind of history of a country that has a royal pedigree would know that fashion and form always trickle down from the very top. The king and queen set the tone, they set the style, and if they decided, as did happen in England for centuries, I don't know if it was for centuries, but for a long time, French was the official language of the court, even though it was England. That's
right. So after the Normans arrived in 1066, it carried on for probably about at least 300 years.
Right.
As the language of the royal court.
Mm-hmm. And I would say at least by the time of Henry V, I think England had become the standard. Right. But again, it was set by the court. And so when the I guess sort of the elite of society use something, after a while it can trickle down. There's actually a scene in The Devil Wears Prada, the Meryl Streep Anne Hathaway movie, where Anne Hathaway shrugs because Meryl Streep's character is obsessing over the color of a belt. And she thinks, well, it's just blue. Who cares? And she said, what do you mean, who cares? This is going to be a part of my major fashion line. We are the elite. And within a season or two, it's going to trickle down to basically your regular stores, the Walmarts, the Kmarts, the malls, because it's going to find one iteration after another based on what is essentially the royalty of this industry. And this seems to be a very common thing. And I would imagine language follows the same path. If the elite choose to use a word, after a while, it might disseminate in its own way throughout the rest of society.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, you do sometimes hear other kind of narratives, like where a certain sound, maybe it was being used by the working class in London, and then it creeps into the speech of the upper classes, and they start using it as well.
Interesting.
So the sound I'm thinking of is the sound that in southern British English, when you want to wash yourself, not in a shower, you have a bath. Bath. And that sound, class, bath. I mean,
right.
I'm from the north of England, from near Manchester.
Okay.
And I grew up saying bath and class. So it's not quite the same as American
right
sound, but
right.
It's certainly a different one to bath and class. And that sound seems to have come in at the beginning of the 19th century. And it probably came in from Cockney, from the London dialect, and spread through the private schools and the educated elite, and then it became the standard for what should we call it? King's English.
Yeah, I guess the King's English now, but for
the pronunciation, whatever they call it.
Well, and that to me is fascinating, because anyone using language is basically a living historical document. Not in the ways that they may be aware, but as you say, usage of a word or pronunciation of a syllable or a consonant changes over time, and we can't always pinpoint why this happens. It just, as Richard Dawkins, he's the one who coined the term meme. It is simply a neurological phenomena that is able to replicate itself. And you say Cockney, a lot of people, they understand Cockney to be that working class that they've seen in films. And Michael Caine's one of the... Yeah. Michael Caine, Bob Hoskins
is an excellent example.
Yeah, obviously, if you're a voice actor, you know how to do Michael Caine. You can't do him right if you don't do the Cockney. Right. But what a lot of people don't know is Cockney came from actually a very small, concentrated area of London. And apparently, it's based on the idea that if you were close enough to hear the bells of a particular church, then you're from the area where you would hear Cockney. But Cockney as an actual accent that people are aware of is worldwide thanks to media. But it's all from this area that's, a few square miles at best.
Yeah. And of course it must have spread out from that area as well. But to identify yourself as a true Cockney, you needed to be born within that area.
Right.
I suppose, traditionally.
Yeah. And another thing I find interesting is how pronunciation will change over a generation, and sometimes it won't even change from person to person. It will change within one person's usage. I have not verified this, but it's easy enough to do, that Queen Elizabeth, may she rest in peace, when she first was coronated, would use RP, received pronunciation, very, very proper. Whenever she would give a public speech, her diction, her rhythm were very, very much very proper and very carefully spoken. And yet they say towards the end of her life, she had dropped some of that. And I don't know if that was conscious or not.
I think received pronunciation is changing. Changing. In some ways, it's changing ever so slightly. So you just have to listen to the Queen's speech, from 2 or 3 years ago, and compare it with the Queen's speech she always gave a speech at Christmas.
Mm-hmm.
You could just listen to her when she was quite young, giving
Right.
a speech when she first became queen, and then listen to her, a few years ago, and the way she speaks is slightly different.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely it has changed. And another thing I notice with my students, because I teach in the south of England, and quite a lot of students speak a kind of standard, educated British English, quite close to what you might call modern or something.
Mm-hmm.
But it's changing. They're starting to say things that in British English used to have different pronunciations. So any word, a lot of words beginning with "bu," like the female version of in cattle, you have a cow
Mm-hmm.
and what used to be called a bull.
Right.
Or if you want to buy meat, you go to the butcher.
Uh-huh.
I think that's traditional RP. I don't speak pure RP, but I can
Right.
do it.
Right.
And I spend so much time teaching in the south of England,
Right.
I automatically do it, I suppose. But I think most students, some of them are starting to say butcher.
Really?
Went to the butcher to buy, and they don't say book, the thing you read. They say book.
Book. Really?
Book.
And then
Yeah,
I've noticed.
I don't know how you say.
Yeah, this might be more Liverpudlian.
What do you read?
Yeah, it might be more Liverpudlian to say book. But I don't know what part of the country that would be.
I mean, my father was from Bolton. He used to say book.
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 Yeah.
Book.
Yeah. So much of what I have learned about languages has been from my own vocation of being a voice actor, and we can get into the Lord of the Rings work I've done. But I once remember working on a World War II game, I believe it was, and it was necessary for me to do about 4 different parts in the game. Now, very often with voice actors, they'll hire you to do one particular role, but they'll throw another couple at you to be able to fill out the cast and not have to keep casting one person for every single line. They need to be more, efficient with it. So on the actual day, they had a dialect coach, which I had not encountered before. But this was basically the best known, most famous dialect coach. His name was Robert Easton, and he has passed away. But he was known as the Henry Higgins.
I've heard the name.
Yeah, he was known as the Henry Higgins of Hollywood. He would work with everybody. And he worked with me, and he was very gracious. He said, you've got a pretty good ear, so you've kind of got this down, but let me give you a couple of tips. So we chose 4 different parts of England to make the characters from, because he said you got to do 4 different English soldiers.
So I'm interested now. Which 4 areas did you
I'm going to try. I don't think I can remember all 4, but we did definitely do a Cockney. And he kept me honest because it's so easy to do a very poor Cockney accent. And it's embarrassing when it doesn't go well.
Mary Poppins, Dick Van Dyke had a go at doing
Dick Van Dyke, I hope he lives for another 100 years. He is one of the most beloved actors in the business. But my God, did he ever mangle that accent? It wasn't even
I remember
close.
as a child watching Mary Poppins and thinking, the chimney sweeper's a nice man. I was about 5 or 5.
Yeah.
But where is he from? I couldn't quite work out where he was.
It's not England.
Maybe it's London. I'm not sure.
It's not.
But I was not from London.
Of course. It's certainly not anywhere I'm aware of. That accent is not from anywhere. There's just no, he occasionally brushes up against it, but he never, hey, bless him. He did his best with it. But I'm sure there was a Cockney in there, and I'm sure we did probably a standard. Just basically, it might have, I don't even know if it would have been RP. If it was an officer, he might have said, let's make this one RP. He's going to be better educated.
Scots?
I don't know if we would have done Scots. I can do Scottish. And of course, there's not just one Scottish. There are several. There's Glasgow, Edinburgh, like I voice matched Craig Ferguson for the How to Train Your Dragon TV show. There was an animated series based on the movie. And Craig is very Scottish. He's never tried to hide his accent, even when he worked here in the States. And what I was able to do was he so overpronounces his words. He loves to draw them out. It was something for me to hold on to. And I have Scottish in my lineage, and so maybe it was just easier for me. So
Maybe you've inherited it somehow.
yeah,
We're
perhaps.
back on Tolkien. Tolkien's, when he was being a little bit unlinguistic, unscientific, he thought you could kind of inherit memories of
Yeah,
languages.
yeah, that's that as they call that's a lot of woo woo right there.
Yeah,
It could just be, I've always said if you want to be able to be a mimic, you need two things. You need an ear, and you need the ability to manipulate your voice. Most people have one and not the other. Some people have both, and I have both of those. So he would, and what I'm very good at is if you say I want you to do an Indian or Pakistani accent, off the top of my head I could give you a broad approximation of it. But if you play it for me and let me sit with it, then I can do it. I can
yeah,
regurgitate
yeah,
it. But in this case, what got more challenging to me was when he said, "Let's go into the Midlands," or "Let's go somewhere around Cheshire. Let's go up near the Lake Country." And then he started to describe to me why these accents sounded differently than the ones you would find in the south of England.
yeah.
There's too much distance. But I remember the way he characterized RP was he says, if there is a vowel sound at the end, you've got to go up on it. You don't say country, you say country, like that, and tapestry.
It's very open, isn't it? That country. Yeah,
Yes, yes. And I thought that was interesting. And then he started showing me the same thing with the United States. And this is worldwide, I'm sure. He says there is a Great Lakes accent. Now, the Great Lakes in the United States basically start at the tip of New York State and they move all the way around until you're over in Wisconsin. And he says the accents right around those lakes will be very similar. And this is across tens of millions of people and hundreds of miles of geography. The accent will be similar, and it's because the lakes were there. And once the
mm.
trade and the culture began to connect
Yeah.
itself through sea
It's the
travel.
connection, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. And so I was absolutely fascinated at that one tidbit that you could take a language and have people speak it very similarly, even though they were separated by possibly 1,000 miles, because there was a connection to it. And I'm sure that must be the case in England as well, to a degree.
You don't have the. I think the difference in England is that before the modern period, people always lived where they lived.
Right.
And so there are more centuries of living and speaking English, right back from, well, it must be back a long way, to the 500s, people speaking English in the same valley or the same, uh, and the language has changed over time,
Mm-hmm.
but the accent has had a long time to develop.
Right.
And then if you go from that valley to the next valley, not so far away,
Uh-huh.
it will be slightly different.
Right.
In the United States, you've had 400 years for the accents to develop.
Yeah,
I
we're a
suppose.
young country.
Australia only 200 years,
Right.
and so I think the distances where the same accent is spoken are perhaps greater in those countries, the United
Right.
States, Canada, Australia.
Yeah. And I'm also curious because regular contact between towns and villages and things might be one reason why you start to hear a similar accent, even though there's a bit of distance. Because of the internet, because of how easy it is now for people to do exactly what we're doing now, that, I mean, 50 years ago, it was very hard to imagine two people having a video conference call. Maybe in science fiction films you could. 100 years ago, you couldn't imagine two people having this discussion, period. I mean, just the idea of the telephone reaching as far as it did was not a very common thing. So 500 years ago, somebody living where I live would never meet someone that lived where you lived. You might not even imagine that we existed. But right now, somebody in Los Angeles can speak to someone near London and have the same amount of contact that you might have with somebody that lived one village over a few hundred years ago.
Yeah, that's
We
right.
don't know the full ramifications of how that's going to change our language and our pronunciation, but it would have to, I would think, speed up the process a bit.
wary of making any predictions.
Well, it'll be 100 years or so from now, so you won't have to.
That's true. Because I did my PhD at the University of York in the north of England,
Okay.
and I decided to look at one particular thinker, writer. His name was Henry Sweet.
Uh-huh.
He's often regarded as one of the perhaps the main influence on George Bernard Shaw's invention of Henry Higgins,
Okay.
the real Henry Higgins, if you
Right.
like, Henry Sweet. So he was a Victorian linguist. He was a medievalist. He was interested in medieval literature and history, interested in history of the language and phonetics, voice coaching, this kind of thing. And he predicted that American English and British English would diverge so far that we'd never be able to communicate in 100 years' time. Well, I'm afraid that's not right. We are communicating quite well.
Yeah, exactly. I know that one of the things that you do, like when you're gigging, as we call it here, when you're playing.
Yeah, we also say gigging.
Gigging. Okay.
It's probably an American expression that we now use. I don't know.
It could be. I have no idea where the word gig would come from, too.
No, it's one to look up sometime.
Yeah, because it also has, obviously, there's so many words that have so many different meanings. In the deep South where I grew up in Georgia, and I grew up in Savannah. And in Savannah, there's, and you hear this also in Hilton Head, which is about an hour away from Savannah in South Carolina. And it's called the Low Country. And it's a very marshy area, and it's basically at sea level. And in Savannah, there are 3 or 4 distinct accents, but one of them is the Low Country accent, which is very refined Southern. And many people feel as though that is the closest you might get to English as accents go, because of the way that certain vowel sounds are formed and certain syllables are elongated, as it were. But the word gig can mean a performance, but it can also, we call gigging, when you take a spear and you go trying to spear frogs with it in the shallow water. So what are you doing? We're going frog gigging. It's like, well, I don't know how gig can mean playing guitar at a pub and spearing an amphibian, but they do.
Yeah, it's they often the linguists would call that probably a homophone. A word has probably got a separate origin,
right?
But it sounds the same. I mean, jack is another word. There's a jack in the box,
right?
But in British English, we the device that you use to raise the side of a car if you want to change the wheel, it's called a jack.
We call it that as well.
Yeah.
Although, you call a trunk a boot.
We do. Yeah.
We call it a trunk. A boot is just something you put on your foot.
That's right. So there are examples of homophones there. They're not the same. They sound the same, but they must be different words. They probably have different origins.
Yeah. And that to me is fascinating because here they are, clearly different, and yet if you use them long enough, they just begin to make sense on their own. We have a commercial campaign running right now. It ran during the World Cup. The English use of the word football, or the rest of the world's use of the word football.
Yeah,
the only place I know that the word soccer is used is here in the United States.
Yeah.
And there's this fun they had with it. It's soccer. Well, it's football. And back and forth. Those are potato chips. No, they're crisps.
Yeah.
And, these
there
are...
is all sorts, yeah.
Yeah.
Sidewalk and pavements is another one.
Yeah. Do you not use sidewalk in England?
No, we say pavement.
Really?
Yeah.
We also say pavement, but, usually you say pavement because it's something you fell on. But
yeah,
nobody walks down the pavement. We've never said that. We never will.
Yeah. Well, next time you're in Britain, you'll notice people say walking along the pavement. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. We also...
It's starting to sound, yeah.
Yeah, well, we don't say High Street. We've never used that phrase. We say Main Street. This is the Main Street.
Okay.
It's like, well, where you are, it's High Street.
Yeah, that's true. No.
Yeah.
And Main Street, no, we just don't say it. No, we don't say it.
No. I'm fascinated by that and how that works. And we're just talking about two countries. I'm sure if you take any two adjoining countries with a shared language, you're going to see the same, disparate usage. But
Yeah, I mean, the other thing, of course, is that English is used all over Europe these days, and some words are getting into. I mean, I know German best. So to go back to what we were saying, the word cool is used in Germany. The English word cool is used
mhm,
by young people in Germany in the same way as in Britain and the States.
that is interesting. Huh.
Because the actual German word is cool, cool,
Oh, really?
and they don't use that. They use the English word cool.
Well, and okay, so I guess that is, that's an example of the, I guess, the predominance of English as a language in mass media and culture.
Mass
As
media and culture, and the fact that people use it so much for business
right,
and holidays,
right,
and everywhere they go, German people, when they go abroad, they use English.
uh-huh.
So English has become quite, it's not a second language, but it's starting to get important. Scandinavia, they speak very well. You could almost say it's a second language in Scandinavia, almost.
Would you, knowing the history of the English language and how often it has been used throughout its existence, would you say that it is probably enjoying a peak amount of usage worldwide right now, or is it descending?
Well, that's the question because um, Spanish speakers and Chinese speakers are increase the
Absolutely,
populations of both those areas are increasing.
absolutely.
But English is still at the moment the most widely spoken.
Okay.
Not so much the number of people who speak it, but where it's used and
Geographical reach.
yeah, and who uses it as a second language.
Gotcha.
So yeah, in a way, it's at its peak. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. That will be interesting to watch that because at least here in the United States, Latin culture is growing very rapidly,
mm.
and you're seeing more couples like myself. My wife and I are a mixed race couple.
Oh yeah, you said yeah.
Yeah, and so I even before I met my wife, I decided I was going to need to learn Spanish. I took a little bit of it in high school, and it didn't really take. And I took a little bit of Italian in college, and there was a time, it was about probably 15 years ago, when I was in Los Angeles and it was at a red light, and there was a guy driving a van next to me, and he was Hispanic and he spoke no English and he was lost and he was trying to get to the airport. I could get that much out of him. And he needed directions, and I couldn't help him because I didn't speak Spanish. And I thought, yes, I know we're in America, but more people speak Spanish in Los Angeles than there are people who speak English. There's no reason for me not to learn, at the very least, how to help the next person that asks for directions. And
Yeah,
so,
so that you could say, go straight on,
yeah,
turn right,
sigue
turn left.
derecho, sigue derecha, yeah, y entonces puedo ayudarlo. I can
Muy
help
bien,
him now.
you're getting there. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm getting there. It's very slow, but I live with a Spanish speaker.
Do you have children and are they bilingual?
We do have a son and a daughter. They're 11 and 9. They're not bilingual, but my wife does use Spanish around them more. And now my son at 11 has taken to saying te amo now when he says good night. I love you.
Yeah,
And we encourage that because it's people make perfect the enemy of the good. They think, "Oh, I'm not any good at speaking this language." Well, are you better today than you were yesterday? Just build a very solid foundation. Learn how to say the rudimentary things. The rest of it will come.
right.
We're trying to
Yeah.
encourage that in our children. We want you to try and express something using Spanish, even if it's, "Can I have a glass of water?" Please do
Mm.
that. And obviously studying how languages evolve, I'm sure that the quickest way to learn it is to use it functionally and not
Oh,
just
yeah.
not just academically.
But I think, yeah, using it functionally and having a good motivation to want to learn it, those
Right.
things.
Right. Exactly. Now, when you're teaching your students, are there different topics that you will cover? Like, in other words, is there a class for one particular area, a class for another area, or do you basically teach one thing?
I teach separate topics, separate things, really.
Okay.
So one area of teaching is literature, and I teach Old English literature. So
Okay.
we usually start with probably the most famous poem, the story of Beowulf.
Right.
Beowulf, the monster fighter, I suppose.
Right.
And I start with that because it's the most famous,
Right.
not because it's the easiest, because it's not the easiest.
Okay.
I hope my students aren't listening right now, but if they are, this is why I did it. I started with Beowulf because you've heard of it,
Right.
and it makes sense to start with the most culturally significant
Right.
poem So start with that. And we don't get them to read all of it in the original, but we do get them to read some of it in the original. There's a set passage, and they have to prepare that for the exam in the original language. So in a separate class, I will teach them a little bit about how to read the language and
Mm-hmm.
how to pronounce it,
Mm-hmm.
how to recognize some of the grammar and so on, enough so that you can read. And I think that learning to speak it in the sense of being able to pronounce it,
Mm-hmm.
as well as sounding good. I say you can go to a cocktail party now and count 10 in Old English and
Right.
read off the beginning of Beowulf,
Mm-hmm.
But it just helps to make the connections with modern English. You can hear sometimes that the word is related to modern English. It also helps you to get to get the rhythm of the poetry,
Mm-hmm.
and it also helps because you've got the rhythm in your head. It helps you to remember it and helps you to learn it.
Right.
All right. So I'm kind of doing a bit of language teaching, and we're doing literature teaching as well there.
Gotcha.
And that's separate. In a separate course, I teach about the English language and how to analyze the English language. And we talk about accents and different varieties of English and what else? Different styles of English and grammar of modern English,
Mm-hmm.
vocabulary and how it's been influenced by so many different other cultures because English is now a world language. So that's like a separate course altogether, really.
Right.
It's like two separate things. I'm teaching medieval studies and I'm teaching the English language.
Beowulf was written. I don't know if they have an exact date for when it was written, but the time it was written was, what was that, around 5th or 6th century?
Well, that's when it's set. That's when the story is set. That's
Okay.
not 5th century.
But it was written hundreds of years after that then.
Well, it's difficult, and someone will disagree with me for sure if I say, but I'm going to say about 800.
Okay. So
That's where quite a lot of people think, maybe about 800.
Okay, so that is pretty much smack in the middle of Anglo-Saxon times.
Yeah.
Gotcha. And I think the interesting thing about Beowulf is, as a story, I think a lot of people aren't aware of just how often other stories kind of take elements of Beowulf and use them later on. The idea of this, sometimes it's a dragon, other times, yes, it is a troll. The idea of a hero that achieves these superhuman feats, the idea of the hall, where, in Danish and Anglo-Saxon times, the hall was where everybody met. It was a focal point of culture, and a lot of it takes place in the hall, and the story is relayed in the hall, and a lot of it is just, it is a very rich treasure that has been mined over and over again in countless other stories that have come after it. So I would think the significance isn't just the language, but in the kind of story that it tells, that has been told.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's a story of it starts off with a king and a dynasty, and he builds this great hall, and it's marvelous, and the poet sings a kind of creation hymn, and you start to think, well, this hall is a little bit symbolic. This is our life on Earth,
right?
And it's threatened by a monster that comes out of the dark every night.
Uh-huh.
He can't deal with it. Nobody can solve this problem. And then far away, in another part of Scandinavia, the young hero hears about this problem, and it feels called. It's his vocation. to go and prove himself as a hero
Mm-hmm.
and cleanse the whole of the monster to rescue the Danes from their monster.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of hero story is, of course, found all over the world.
Right.
Various.
Right.
He goes off, and it's 2 days sail with his band of men, and they arrive, and of course they look like a threat when they arrive. They're heavily armed,
Right.
and the Coast Guard has to test their credentials. Who are you? What manner of men are you that come to our shores? And then he states his aim, and then the man decides that they're trustworthy, they can be believed, and he takes them to the hall, and they're tested again. And then the king grants the hall to here to have and to hold. I place this hall in your hands for a night.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the moment of the preparation for the fight takes quite a long time,
Yeah.
but it's kind of necessary. It's not just straight. Here's the hero, and here's his first fight. After 5 minutes, it builds up slowly and surely with background and symbolism and all sorts of things going on before we have the actual fight. And I guess that's part of it. And then the problem is that there's never only one monster, is there? So they're celebrating the killing of Grendel, and a new monster arrives, and it starts again. And then I suppose it's an unusual story in that it says in one sentence, 50 years, 50 winters, he ruled the kingdom for 50 winters back home. He goes home and celebrates, and then he ruled the kingdom for 50 winters until, and there's always this until a monster appeared, a dragon this time. And the dragon is even more of a problem than a troll or a Grendel. And so this is the ultimate test. And also, it's a debate as well. Should he have fought the dragon? He is the king, but 50 years later, he must be 70 years old.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, should you go fighting dragons at age 70?
The eternal question.
That's right. It just reminds me a little bit of one of Clint Eastwood's later films where he's an old man, and he knows he's an old man, and he puts that into the story a bit. He's not quite the hero that he once was.
Exactly. Did you find, or have you found, Tolkien using some of the same ideas? Obviously, a lover of Anglo-Saxon culture and literature himself. Did you find that in his books he would use some of these elements? Obviously, you have a dragon. Obviously, you have an aged king. You have there's never just one monster, obviously, and do you see? Tolkien famously said, "I don't believe in allegory. I don't have allegory in my books." I very clearly see allegory in his books, but he didn't like the idea of it. But
he didn't like allegory if it was too easy.
Okay.
I think you might, So I don't know what's the most famous allegory in world literature. There's John Bunyan wrote a story called Pilgrim's Progress about, and the hero is a religious allegory. So the hero is a Christian and he's going on a journey, and that's life.
Mm-hmm.
And every obstacle it has a meaning. Every detail of the story has one meaning, and I think that's what Tolkien didn't want people to do.
Right.
Find one meaning in every event. The dragon is the devil or something like this. The dragon is sometimes like the devil a little bit, but it's more symbolic. It can remind you of the devil, but he's also a dragon in his own right.
Mm-hmm.
He can be greed as well, lying on his heap of treasure.
Right.
All sorts of meanings. So I think I tried to make a distinction then between allegory and symbolism and say, well, it's symbolic without being pure allegory.
Gotcha. So you don't have to be burdened by a lesson per se, but it can evoke an idea, an effective idea. I have never read. I don't know why. I read The Two Towers and I read the Return of the King. I don't know why I skipped the Fellowship of the Ring.
Okay.
I don't know why that is. I read The Hobbit many times as a kid,
Yeah.
And
The
I
Hobbit's
grew.
quite short, so you can read it very quickly.
It
Really.
is. In fact, we had, I hope my mom still has this. I'll have to ask her. We had a coffee table book of The Hobbit, and it was based on the animated movie that they made in the 70s. Rankin
Hmm.
Bass was the production company, and Orson Bean was the voice of Bilbo. And famously, John Huston was the voice of Gandalf. And he was perfect. And
Mm.
I would read through this, I would look at the lovely illustrations, and The Hobbit, I think, as a work of literature, it does seem to be written for children more. And then he seemed to raise the stakes a bit when he got into the Fellowship trilogy, the Lord of the Rings trilogy,
Mm.
which I understand he wanted to publish as one book. And they said it's a bit long, might want to break it up into three. So he probably was able to be a bit more nuanced with his symbolism once he got into those books. And then you have the Silmarillion, which basically is notes, a lot of indices and things like that. That I had it, I read through it, but it wasn't written like a book. It was written more like a collection of stories that I guess he had never had a chance to really fully flesh out.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. Yeah. There is a book called Unfinished Tales, I think that's what it's called,
Mm-hmm.
where he did start to flesh some of them out.
Uh,
And some of the early versions are in, you can get these volumes and volumes of early work called The History of Middle Earth.
mm-hmm.
And some of the Book of Lost Tales, some of those stories are more fleshed out than they are in the Silmarillion. They're recognizable as the same stories,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes a little bit different, but often they've got more detail, more dialogue, more characters
Uh,
involved. So yeah, in some ways, it's a shame that he didn't. He found it quite hard to finish projects he started. This was
oh,
true of his academic work,
oh,
and it
really?
was also true of his fiction and his imaginative writing as well. And so he needed his friends. He had a lot of friends, and they would encourage him to. So
C.S. Lewis among them.
C.S. Lewis was one of them, yeah. And I I went to Malvern School once to give a talk, and the widow of the headmaster there, she said that the headmaster, the head teacher of this old school, um, they knew Tolkien and Lewis, and they said that one weekend Tolkien was saying, "Oh, I'm not sure if I'm going to finish the Lord of the Rings," and they persuaded him that weekend to carry
I
on
guess
with
over a
it.
couple of pints. They would
Yeah,
famously
that's
go to
right.
this
Probably
pub.
sitting in
Yeah.
one of the pubs in the village there.
Well, which is there must be one pub where they're particularly known for gathering, is there not?
Yeah, there's more than one, but there's one. It's called the Eagle and Child.
Okay.
Unfortunately, it's closed at the moment.
Hmm.
And if anybody from the Eagle and Child is watching
Yeah.
this interview right now, I think you should reopen it because
Yeah.
it's a good draw for visitors, and we want to sit there as well. And it's right in the centre of Oxford, near the university buildings,
Mm-hmm.
the old colleges.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the other pub nearby is called um, the Lamb and Flag, and they used to go there as well. And that one has reopened. So
Okay.
yeah. So there were various pubs that we know they used to go to, but they especially used to have the meetings of the Inklings, or one of the meetings of the Inklings, that group of writers, they call themselves the Inklings, and they used to meet in the child in one of the small rooms and read each other's work and comment on it,
Mm-hmm.
each other writing.
Well, I noticed in your CV you've been teaching at Oxford for, I don't know, going on 20 years,
Yeah,
roughly,
that's right. Yeah, yeah,
which would have also been right around the time the last of the Lord of the Rings movies was coming out. Were you noticing a renewed interest in Tolkien at the time in academia, or did it take a few years to take hold? But I'm sure there must be more students now that want to take these classes, that want to learn about this, especially now there's an Amazon
yeah,
series going, so it's
yeah.
permeating Tolkien.
Definitely, there's more interest again. I spent a year teaching in Germany a few years ago. I was a visiting professor in Düsseldorf,
Hmm.
and so I was able to design my own courses. So I did a course on the Lord of the Rings and medieval literature. So we were looking at some of the stories and medieval poems that influenced the Lord of the Rings.
Hmm.
And there was definitely a strong interest. I was once sometimes surprised that people hadn't read the book. I thought everyone had read the book, but
Well,
that's me and
students are
I'm being naive, you know.
students are students. There's a movie out now. So wait a minute. In 2 hours, I can know what happened. Like, well, yes and no. You
You can
must be
know
able to
well
tell.
about 6 hours of watching the film,
Yeah,
probably.
exactly. Yeah, okay. Not 2 hours, three. In 9 hours, you can cover the trilogy. And Peter
Yeah,
Jackson, the filmmaker, was pretty thorough, but there were still characters he had no time
yeah.
to include. I keep hearing Tom Bombadil was not in the movies.
No, that's right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
he couldn't find a place to fit him in, I suppose. But as somebody who I'm sure you must have seen the movies, do
yeah. I've
you
seen that.
do you feel as though they ring true enough to Tolkien's vision? And linguistically, when you hear Elvish, when you hear Orcish, things like that, does it
Yeah,
feel like this is what he
linguistically, they
intended?
did a good job,
Okay.
and they did things like the Hall of the King of Rohan is very well done. I
Uh
thought
huh.
it's in terms of, in visual terms,
Right.
in the language. Uh, yeah, so all the languages they obviously did their research and consulted the right kind of people for that.
Hmm.
And sometimes they would add things which I thought were sometimes slightly spoiled. So, for example, in that scene where they arrive at the King of Rohan's hall, King Theoden's hall,
Hmm.
and they're summoned in and they start to walk towards the throne. And in the book, they simply walk towards the throne and stop, and it's all very solemn and formal and correct. In the film, they had some people trying to attack them with their fists, and Legolas was fighting them off with. It just this would not happen.
Right.
This is a formal court. This is the king's court. Even if they were hostile, they wouldn't have people trying to attack them with their fists. I don't know. It just seemed a little bit childish, you know.
In filmmaking terms, there must have been a moment where they were looking at the script or they were shooting this and they were thinking, I don't know, I don't like the pace. It's dragging here. Let's do something about
Yeah,
it. Maybe when they edited, they said, all right, we've got to put this in. And this is obviously authenticity is sometimes the sacrificial lamb at the altar of pace and audience accessibility. It happens a lot.
yeah. I mean, it happens. You're right. You're absolutely right, and I'm sure the reason is right. It's, that they want pace. So if they started following the book
Right.
with the Fellowship of the Ring, it would be very slow at first and idyllic and
Right.
pastoral and hobbits having parties
Mm-hmm.
and a little bit of a threat. I mean, you could build it up like in perhaps like a Dracula movie. There's these black riders
Right.
coming in and it's getting more and more dangerous. But they didn't choose to do that. The pace is absolutely very quick, almost from the start.
Yes. Well, especially because the first movie, when they had been trying to make these movies for forever and a day, and
Yeah, sure.
finally the elements had come together, and they had pitched the idea of trying to do them all in one film, and they were
Yeah.
speaking to the head of New Line Cinema at the time, and this would have been in the late '90s. And he said, after the pitch, he said, "Why don't we just make it three movies?" And they thought, "Oh, at last!" But they realized too that this was going to cost them $300 million, which at the time had never been done. You're gambling
Mm.
that the first movie will be a success, so that the other two will be possible, and you're shooting them all concurrently. Well, not exactly concurrently, but you're going to shoot them in sequence, all in one long production. And so I imagine with that first movie, they said, you know what? We can't take any chances. When in doubt, throw in a fight scene, by God. And by the time you get to Return of the King, he's paced it much differently. He's taking a whole extra half hour to tell the story. And at that point, he realized I can slow things down a bit.
That's right. Once you've got the interest of the audience, I suppose.
Exactly. Once you know that the coffers are full, everything's going to be fine. But I do know from having worked on the games, and I know that one of the reasons why I contacted you was because I thought he might be interested to know what it was like making these games. Although you don't strike me as a gamer, so I don't know if you played any of the video games.
I haven't actually played any of them, so
No,
you'd have to. Uh,
and no, they've been making them for
but
years.
it's interesting to hear how
Well,
there's similar
they
problems to
were
tackle, I suppose.
right. Like I was only there for the recording aspect of it, but they would also show you the conceptual art and they would show you the graphics
Yeah.
they already had. They would show you some of the cinematic scenes. They would show you, here's an example of the gameplay. And I did several of the games. The first entry point for me was I voice matched Viggo Mortensen for the Return of the King game. He was no longer available. And
Yeah.
so I learned that I can do a pretty good Viggo Mortensen if he's shouting. So when he's giving his speech before one of the large battles, I see in you the same fear that would take the heart of me. So I can do him when he's loud. And it's a video game, there's a lot of fighting. So there's a lot of being loud. But they flew me up to the campus at EA Games where they made this. And I thought, well, that's interesting. They want me to be there. They could have recorded me in Los Angeles. And so while I was there, before we started recording, they had a woman come in to the room and talk to me for a minute. And she said, let me hear your performance. And I started doing Vigo, and I could tell from her accent she was British. And I thought, oh, okay. They want to make sure that I'm not mangling this dialect here. And she said, that's fine. What you're doing is sort of what Vigo and the other American actors did. They did sort of a pan-British accent. They're not, with the exception, I think Sean Astin did something that was a little more regional with his.
Yes.
He wouldn't say I, he would say oi. You know,
Yeah.
I mean to, back Longshanks or I'll have you. So I don't know if that's Kentish, if that's from a particular area.
Definitely, it's a southern thing to sort of south of Birmingham down to through to London.
He made more of a regional choice, but in my case, she was there to make sure that I was sort of on point. And then she stayed for about 5 minutes, and she said, "Okay, I'm off. He's fine." But they were concerned enough where they didn't want somebody to, I don't know, to pull a Dick Van Dyke and embarrass the production. And I did another game. I think it was called Third Age. And I played, I might not even be a character from the literature, as Elagost the Ranger. So might have been created entirely for the game. But again, pan-British accent, not from anywhere in particular. A clip from the game I used.
In a way that makes sense, though, to me, because if it sounds, too much like Dorset or Cornwall or London, that makes... Then you wonder, well, why has this ranger got a London accent? He's not from London. I know Tolkien did it as well with his trolls in The Hobbit. They speak with Cockney accents.
Yeah, they're very Cockney.
But that's just like a joke, really, for the kids, I think.
Right. Yeah.
But in The Lord of the Rings, which is somehow a bit more adult and a bit more of a full-scale novel, if you have... it's a slight problem, I think. If you have an Irish accent, a very obvious Irish accent or a Scottish accent, you wonder, well, why? Why are they Scottish?
Right.
This is not filmed in Scotland. This is not taking place in Scotland.
Right.
That's a problem. So something which is neutrally British maybe is better than something that's too regional or too much tied to one country. Scotland or one part of England. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Well, for an American, it would land differently for us. But I take your point, because if somebody set a fantasy world that happened in America, because it may be Middle Earth for Tolkien, but it was essentially England. If you
sort of England and Europe or something.
Exactly, and the Corsairs come from clearly what would have been probably Northern Africa, things like that. So that's what he meant it to be. If you were to set a fantasy world in the United States, in the area that would eventually become the United States, And you
Okay,
give
so
some
North America.
exactly, and you give some characters a Southern accent. You give some characters a Midwestern accent. You get some characters a Mid-Atlantic or a Maine or a Bostonian accent. It might shake people out of the story a little bit. They may think, well, why is this guy sounding like he's from the south of Boston? And why does this
Yeah.
guy have to sound like he's a redneck from the Ozark Mountains? And I would imagine,
Or a Brooklyn accent or something like that. What's that?
yeah, yeah. So if you've
It
got,
would just feel a bit,
if your ranger
what's he,
sounds like,
this guy from
hey,
Brooklyn doing, you know?
yeah, hey, I'm gonna go and scout ahead. It's like, wait a minute. I suppose he wouldn't want them thinking in contemporary terms.
Yeah,
So,
that's the problem, I think.
yeah.
Yeah.
And that is the thing about accents is that they do become very specific. More to that point, I voice matched Mike Myers for the Cat in the Hat movie back in 2003.
Oh, yeah.
Not for the movie itself. He did the entire movie, but when it came time to do, say, a talking toy and a Burger King commercial and whatever else in the video game, I was the official voice match. And he was very hands-on. He was never there, but I was recording a commercial. And I was doing the Cat in the Hat's voice. And he would listen to it later and send notes back to the directors. And they would say, no, you're sounding too Brooklyn. You need to sound more Queens or vice versa. And I was having a hard time parsing that out. But to him, it was plain as day. Because to him, he based the Cat in the Hat's voice on this particular region of New York. And he needed that reflected in it. And
Okay.
yeah,
That's the other thing, isn't it? When you really want a specific
yes,
locality for your accent.
right. Which again is why I have this, which I suppose is an unanswerable question. Why, like, if we were to look at the accents of New York City, well, you're going to start with the Dutch because
Okay.
that it was New Amsterdam back in the 1600s, or I believe it was the 1600s.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, because there is no Native American impact that I'm aware of as far as accents go. Now, there are still names, obviously, all over the place. The names are everywhere. But if you're looking at accents, you're going to start with the Dutch, then you're going to go to the English, and then you have the influx later of there's a Hebrew influence. There's going to
Yeah.
be
Yiddish as well, I suppose, for the
Yiddish
same reason.
big time, and then there's going to be Irish, Italian, Scottish. All of these things mix. How do you get a Brooklyn accent out of that after a while is beyond me. But a linguist would have a field day with that stew, with all of those ingredients. And
Yeah. And I suppose one of the things is it is a stew as well. It's kind of
yeah,
taken on a new identity, hasn't it? And
right.
so sorting out which bit is which ingredient is which.
Can you think of a city besides London or New York that is a primarily English language city that would have that amount of, that much of a melting pot effect on accents? And how often you might see the accents or hear the accents changing from region to region. Like there's a comedian, I can't remember his name, but he said in London, he was joking, but he said in London, somebody would say, that bloke says he's from 7th Street, but he sounds like he's from 5th Street. And because over 1,000 years, you might get that much of a distinction,
Yeah.
that much of a surgical distinction. Can you think of another city that might have that kind of melange of accents?
It's going to be a big place.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of my own, not my own city, but my own region, the northwest of England, Lancashire.
Okay.
It used to be a bigger administrative unit than it is now. And it used to include Manchester
Okay.
and Liverpool and part of the Lake District as well. So it was quite a lot of different accents. And they're slight from one town to the next, changes slightly. And then you get to Manchester and Liverpool, and it suddenly changes drastically.
Right.
And Liverpool is an interesting one because it's so, okay, it spills out a bit up the Mersey Valley and the region, the Merseyside region. But Liverpool is so different from the rest of the Northwest.
Yeah.
So different. I don't know if you can do the Liverpool accent. Is that
Well,
one of yours?
everybody, the entry point for Liverpool for everybody is the Beatles.
Yeah,
And
sure.
and even in those four accents, you've got John, who's a bit more sardonic in the way
Yes.
he speaks, and you have Paul, who's he's a bit more up. He's
Yeah.
his pace is and then you have George Harrison, who's very soft spoken, but they use a lot of the same pronunciation there. But
Yeah.
that's not Manchester, And
No.
I guess what they would
No,
probably
it's
use a
not.
lot of
And in
Scouse.
Manchester,
Yeah.
there's I'd say there are at least three accents. And one of them is a little similar to Liverpool, but
Hmm.
what I'm saying is that Liverpool just sounds so different to the rest
Right.
of the area.
Right.
And because, I mean, where I come from, Blackburn, it's how far is it from Liverpool? About an hour away on the train.
Hmm.
And someone from Blackburn would talk like this, right?
Right.
And he would say, I'm going down pub now this evening. I'm going to drink some pints with my mates.
Hmm.
And this is how we talk in Blackburn. We have an R in the middle of words, which is like in America or in Ireland or something like that. But it's not at all like the Liverpool accent, it seems to me.
Why is
And
there a geographical reason for that? Is there? You mentioned a valley. Is it
well,
because it's just
I think it's not the valley so much, just that's the way it's spread out of Liverpool. I think it's because it's a port and that it had influence from Ireland.
Hmm.
I mean, think of the Beatles. They've got Irish names, at least two of them, right?
Yeah.
Paul McCartney and John Lennon. These are Irish names.
Right. And
Original.
Richard Starkey, Ringo
Yeah,
Starr, Richard.
Yeah, that probably, I don't know where that name's from.
I
I mean, Liverpool's got this kind of Irish influence there,
right.
and there's similarities in the culture, and two cathedrals. One cathedral is Roman Catholic, one cathedral is Protestant.
Mhm.
I mean, rules, and there must have been, during the time of the British Empire, there must have been all sorts of people from different nationalities going through.
Well,
So that's my only parallel to New York, maybe in that, or maybe London, of course.
yeah.
London.
Well, also, I mean, you'll find this everywhere, and that's why I'm fascinated by how geography and trade, obviously, is going to impact the way a language is spoken and pronounced, the way accents will form. And again, for Americans who don't have a chance to travel to England, and I've only been once, and we got about a day and a half in London. I wanted to see the Cotswolds and the Lake Country and all of that. And you need time, but
You need time. You need a lot of time.
our entry point, like the most modern English you're going to hear right now, is if you watch Ted Lasso, which is a very big hit here. And one of my favorite characters in Ted Lasso, besides Ted himself, who's very Southern, is Jamie Tart. And I don't know if you've seen the show, but
I haven't actually. I mean,
okay.
I've heard of it.
My guess is Jamie Tart is a Mancunian. I think he's from Manchester,
Yeah.
and and he's very much a middle class kind of guy, and he's mad that he's wearing something nice to a premiere of a party, and he wants his jacket to have graffiti on it, but the way he pronounces graffiti is look, no graffiti. So he doesn't say graffiti, he says graffiti, right? Yeah. And that is obviously that's very working class, but I couldn't tell you if it's specifically from Manchester because you could probably find people in London that speak that way as well.
Yeah, the way you said it sounded northern, but you could find it in Manchester, Sheffield,
right,
Leeds, that kind of pronunciation.
Right.
So
well, also there's a culture like when I saw The Kingsman. The movie The Kingsman, which I really loved, and that's a Matthew Vaughn movie. So he would make movies with Guy Ritchie, but he made Layer Cake, which I really liked as well. And you're seeing this mingling of British underworld accents as well in Layer Cake. But in Kingsman, Taron Egerton plays the main character, and he's basically just your local hood. And he's got his we call them sneakers, but you guys call them trainers. And he has his vest, he has his hat on a certain way. And he says, bruv. Right, bruv. Don't stay around, bruv. Right? You don't say brother. You say bruv. Right?
Yeah.
And fam. Everyone says fam now. And so he has an accent that sounds very northern to me, but he's smack in the middle of London speaking it.
Yeah, I don't see. You wouldn't say that. It might sound northern, but that sounds to me like London.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's fascinating to
the way
me.
you. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, and there's so much cross pollination that happens. For example, in Georgia, okay, you have a drastic topography change because Georgia is a coastal state, but only part of it is on the coast. So the southeastern part of Georgia is all low country, and it is all marsh. And the accents you hear. This is one of them, and it's more cultured. But then you're going to hear some that are like one of my classmates in high school says, "Oh, I don't have a very good average in Spanish class." So, he wouldn't say Spanish or Spanish, Spanish. And then
Change.
if you go up northwest, you get to the mountains, the beginning of Appalachia. And
Okay.
Appalachia was settled mainly by English and Scots
Mhm.
and especially in the, 17th, 18th, 19th century. If you get up into Appalachia, when I went to University of Georgia, that's in the middle of the northwest part of Georgia where Appalachia is beginning. And I had a hallmate in my dormitory, and his accent, he spoke like this. Last night I drank enough liquor to float a battleship. That's how I drank enough liquor to float a battleship. The way he would stretch out his words was, and I don't know how much of that is English and Scottish, but I know that there's elongations that happen and hard consonants that happen.
It's interesting, isn't it? There might be some of those vowels might go back to
Yeah, who knows? You know,
old settlers,
this is the
and then
mountainous
they get
area.
changed, and
Yeah,
then over time they'll change as well, so they're no longer what they originally were.
right. You said you've just written a book. Please, if you will, could you hold up a copy of it and show
Okay,
us and
I'm
tell us
holding
what
it
it's
up
about?
again.
So,
So this is called the Battle of Malden,
okay,
and this is a battle that took place in the 10th century in England.
okay,
After England had become a country, at the begin in the year 900, England wasn't yet a unified country. There was the famous King Alfred the Great. He was the
right.
king of the Angles and the Saxons. King of his capital was down in the south of England at Winchester.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got an interest in his son, I believe, haven't you? Edward the Elder.
Uh,
Is that right?
yeah,
Edward and Ethelfled.
yeah, and it gets
Yeah,
confusing because Ethelfled's husband was Ethelred, I
that's
believe.
right. And he was Mercian, wasn't he? I believe.
Yes, and she was
Yeah,
called the Lady of the Mercians because she was never quite given the honorific of queen. But in
yeah.
909, they fought the Battle of Tettenhall, which is what my book revolves around. And oh yeah, I mean you're at a major inflection point for Danish supremacy kind of waning.
That's right. So, I mean, there was a TV series, a drama series, a historical drama called The Last Kingdom. I don't know if you saw that.
I'm aware of it, and I know that
Yeah.
Ethelfled is a major character
Yeah. So
in
the
yeah.
yeah, that and starts that's really the hero is from Northumbria.
Hmm.
So in the year 900, there were several kingdoms. There
Right.
was Wessex, that's where King Alfred was, and then the middle of England was Mercia,
Hmm.
and then you had East Anglia and Essex, and then Northumbria in the north.
Hmm.
And because of the Vikings uh, taking over most of the country, apart from a little bit of Northumbria that's left, they took over most of southern Britain, not Wales, but
Hmm.
what's now England, apart from Wessex. So therefore, Wessex was the last kingdom holding out against the Viking invaders.
Right.
And they fought back, and then there was this division into Wessex and Mercia. Wessex and part of Mercia were together, and marriage alliances so they had a common enemy now in the Vikings,
Hmm.
and eventually you had Athelstan, who was King Alfred's grandson, and he was the first king of England because he fought a battle against the Vikings and the Scots at Brunanburh
Hmm.
in 937. I hope I've got my date right.
Hmm.
Um, and so he can claim to be the first king of England. as a nation, as a kind
Right.
of nation state. And then England sort of came into existence. It was very prosperous, but it,
Hmm.
it was a little bit unstable at first. Very prosperous, and they had good taxation and good trade with the continent of Europe. And the first king of England to be king of England without having to fight a battle was King Edgar,
Hmm.
and then he died too early. His two sons, by different marriages, were rivals. They were both very young. One of them was murdered, and King Athelred became another Athel.
Yeah.
They all had similar names because they were all part of the royal family, and they had
Right.
similar names. So Athelred the Unready was king of England in the year 991,
Hmm.
and the Vikings returned. And this was a big invasion force. And they came just north of London. There's another big river called the Blackwater.
Hmm.
And they sailed up the Blackwater to Malden, the small market town, really, these days. And the English or the Essex, the local Essex soldiers met them at Malden, and there was a battle, and the English were defeated. And but the point why it's so famous is that someone who must have been there or knew people who were there wrote a poem about it. So we have this long account of what actually happened
Hmm.
at the battle. It's not like you're writing and using your imagination to recreate this battle at Tettenhall.
Hmm.
Well, Malden, we've got this long account,
Right.
which tells, there were speeches across the water before the battle started. And the Viking messenger said, if you pay us tribute, we will go back to our ships and we will sail away and leave you in peace. And the leader of the East Saxons said, no, the only tribute you're going to get from us is our weapons,
Hmm.
point of our weapons and the edge of our swords. And so they fought the battle. And so my book is really a study of the background, what was going on. And it goes into the details of the actual poem and some of the people who were
Hmm.
involved and tries to interpret the poem. And
So, what would have been the aftermath of the English losing that battle? Because the Danes, after 910, after Tettenhall, they were never quite the same as far as their influence in England. They were not as pervasive, but they were
yeah,
still there. They lingered for a little while
sure.
longer. But
They lingered and their followers settled as farmers
mhm.
and everything. As I say, by the 970s, England was a very peaceful, prosperous nation.
Mhm.
And if King Edgar, this Edgar, if he hadn't died so early, um, maybe that's what would have continued. He was obviously a very strong king, and if he had continued, then the Vikings would not have returned. But they returned from Scandinavia,
Right.
and the whole drama started again. Really, now, this time they came with very large armies.
Mhm.
And in fact, in 1016, there was King Canute became king of England, and he was Danish. So
Uh,
for a while, there was a Danish king on the throne of England.
mhm.
Um, um, but history seemed to go in cycles. So he didn't really. He had two sons by different marriages, and they were rivals, and they didn't last very long. And they invited the son of King Athelred the Unready, who was called Edward. Edward the Confessor became
Mhm.
king, and his cousin was William of Normandy. And so
Mhm.
when he died, William of Normandy thought he had um, a right to take over as King of England. And so there are all these connections to be made. So what I'm saying is that for a while, the Danish, became really important. They were ruling England by the end of this time. But I suppose this battle of Malden, the debate was, should we give money to the Vikings so they go away? Should we pay them tribute? And in a way, for a short time, that was successful. They they paid tribute to the Vikings, and they went away, and their leader might have been a man called Olaf Tryggvason. He went off and became king of Norway. So for Norwegian history, I mean, it was all a long time ago, but Olaf Tryggvason is still a well-known name in Norwegian history. He became an important king of Norway after probably fighting at the Battle of Maldon against the English. So there are all sorts of ramifications in European history, and it's an opportunity to get into into the minds and the thoughts and feelings of these people. What do you do when people invade your country?
Right.
Pay them money to go away, or do you fight them? And the poem obviously says you should fight them, but then they lost.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Yeah.
It's one of these perennial things. How do you deal with a situation like that? It comes back.
Right. That's what I would in researching Tettenhall. There was an event the year before that sort of preceded this, and that was the rescue of St. Oswald's bones from Bardney Abbey.
Okay.
That this was in an area of, I believe it was, I'm not sure if it was Northumbria. I guess it would have been just called the Danelaw. And
the Danelaw is that region where the Viking farmers had settled.
Exactly. And the Anglo-Saxons basically said, we're going to go into this abbey where the bones of St. Oswald were, and he was sort of this warrior saint, and who was vivisected after being killed in battle, and which was wont to happen back then. But the bones would become a holy relic, and so they rescued these bones. And obviously, we don't have a first-hand account of it. We have stories of it happening, but it did happen. So we don't have, I don't know how exact all of these details are, but they did rescue the bones, and it was a slap in the face to the Danes saying, we're taking something, because obviously their religions were at loggerheads with each other as well. That ones were, seen to be as pagans, the others were Christian. And once they rescued these bones, they were also emboldened to continue to push back. And one thing that Ethelfled and her brother Edward promised to the locals was, when we drive the Vikings out, we're going to build fords and reinforcements and things, and which is what they did. But as you say, at Tettenhall, we don't know exactly how many people fought. We don't know how many people died. We can sort of forensically put together some of the conditions, and we know that the Vikings were soundly defeated. We know that 2 of their kings that were on the battlefield at least died that day, and that they were pushed back, and they were never the same after that. But yeah, as far as the numbers, we don't know. Like you said, we don't have that first-hand account of somebody furiously scribbling notes as to what was happening. So, you have to put it together as best you can, and historians can't even all agree specifically on it, but the general idea right. they do get.
It's in some ways it's detective work. It's the Chronicle mentions Tettenhall, you know, and then there's a mention here, and we know the church was, where the church was located or whatever, and so it's putting together these little bits of information, and then imagining what it might have been like. I suppose,
and. What must be interesting from your point of view is you've got a language that you study that in the condition it's in now is so different than the era you're writing about. And yet you could, I guess, and I don't know if you've ever done this, but almost by decade, you can begin to see this change happening in the language and in the words that fall in and out of usage all the way up to the present day.
Yeah, almost, yeah.
So I guess if there's a takeaway, language, as I said before, I do see it as a living historical document, that if you were to compare it to what was being spoken hundreds or even 1,000 years ago, they would seem very distinguishable, very different, almost a completely separate language. But as you say, with a little bit of time, you might be able to get a lot of it. Just ensconcing yourself in it, you might start to hear words that start to make more sense.
That's right. Yeah, like there are many examples. The word, the word for ship
Yeah.
was spelled different. It's spelled SCIP,
Right.
but it was pronounced ship,
Yeah.
we think.
Yeah.
You know, and, I don't know. A loaf of bread was a laugh. Laugh. Okay, it's not quite the same, but it's
Right.
getting there.
And
You know.
so we've come full circle. Well, one day maybe I'll have to talk to you again about the music because I am fascinated by that.
Yeah, we didn't really do the music, did we? No.
Yeah. Well, and this is why I talked to the writer Ian Mortimer. We talked for 3 hours, and there were still things that we didn't get to the music, and so this is just how it goes.
Well, I mean, the music. I know you've got to rush, but we don't have time now. But the music I do is kind of it's a bit hard to describe the genre. But the band. There are usually five of us in the band,
Hmm.
and I suppose it's in the folk. There's a little bit of sort of folk rock, maybe.
Okay.
And the songs, and quite a few of the songs are inspired by the text that I teach and the text that I study,
Okay.
so that they give me ideas for my songs.
Okay. So
Uh,
you do the writing.
I do the writing, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Have you ever, like, I guess sort of in the tradition of the troubadour, have you ever taken songs from a few hundred years ago and either performed them or just simply reinterpreted them?
I've taken an old riddle from the Exeter book from the 10th century,
Okay.
a riddle about the wonder, the miracle of writing, and I just set it to modern music, but it's still in the Old English language.
Oh, that's
Um,
interesting. Well, and the
that's
Anglo-Saxons loved riddles. That was one of
yeah.
their favorite pastimes.
And another of my songs is called The Whale Road. And the
Okay.
Whale Road is like a sort of enigmatic image, but it just means the sea, basically. It's the place where the whales travel.
Gotcha. Well,
So,
actually, that is interesting to compare that with what Tolkien did in his books. He features songs in his
yeah,
books, and he features that one of the most famous passages in The Hobbit is the riddle contest between Gollum
indeed, yeah,
and Bilbo. And I didn't even think of it until now, but as I was writing my book, one of the pastimes of Anglo-Saxons was riddles, and they loved
yeah,
trying to stump each other. And then I just realized that that is a central passage in The Hobbit. Is Bilbo is literally in a battle to the death with Gollum with riddles, and then
yeah,
if you
yeah.
don't know them, you're in trouble.
That's right.
Yeah,
Right.
it's
Yeah,
funny how it makes its way into, and so even now in a movie. It is funny to think of it this way, but 1,000 years ago, the practitioners of this pastime would see their very pastime being digitally represented in a modern motion picture with a character that is completely animated by a computer. So, how language takes us places.
that's right. It certainly does.
Yeah. Well,
And it's changing all the time and developing and
yes,
moving on. And, that's one of the points.
it's an organism. It's an organism used by organisms, and it will change as we change.
One generation speaks ever so slightly different,
Hmm.
sometimes a bit more different for the next generation. And so the language starts to.
Dr. Mark Atherton, I do thank you for your time and your book, The Battle of Malden. Is it available already, or will it be
It
available?
is available already, yeah.
Okay,
It's called The Battle of Malden, War and Peace in 10th century England.
okay, gotcha. Well, then I would encourage everyone to check that out, and I'll have you on again when we want to get deeper into the music. Maybe I'll try and learn enough to where I can jam with you a little bit. You can
Okay,
teach
that
me
would
one
be
of your
fun.
songs. Well, thank you so much, and we'll hopefully talk again.
Yeah, very good to meet you, Chris.
My pleasure.